Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The Blue Ridge Mountains of Appalachia hold many secrets. Valleys that never see full daylight, hollows where sound behaves strangely, and remains of dwellings that speak to a desperate way of living that most modern Americans can scarcely comprehend. Among these remnants of a harsher time, the Stump houses of McDowell County, West Virginia, stand as silent witnesses to events that official records have largely forgotten or deliberately obscured. In the autumn of 1887, a land surveyor named Thomas Blackburn first documented what he called peculiar habitations, fashioned from the remains of ancient trees in the most remote sections of the county. His field notes, preserved in the West Virginia State Archives until they were transferred to microfilm in 1963, contain the first official recognition of what would later become known as the Stump Houses phenomenon. The massive stumps left behind by timber companies, some measuring 8 to 10 feet in diameter, provided ready-made shelter for those willing to hollow them out and adapt them for human habitation. These remnants of virgin forest, centuries old before being felled, were transformed into dwellings by men who had retreated from society for reasons that varied from economic necessity to something far more troubling. Blackburn's field journal, which spans over 200 pages of meticulous observations and detailed sketches, devotes significant attention to these unusual structures. The craftsmanship evident in the conversion of these stumps into habitable spaces suggests skills beyond those typically associated with frontiersmen or itinerant workers, he wrote. The precision with which interior surfaces have been shaped, the ingenious use of natural contours to create storage areas, and the careful preservation of the outer bark to maintain structural integrity all speak to a deliberate and sophisticated approach to construction. His notes include detailed measurements and architectural observations. The largest specimen, located in what locals refer to as the Deep, measures approximately 9 feet in diameter at its base. The interior has been hollowed to create a circular living space approximately 7 feet in diameter, with the walls tapering slightly inward as they rise to a height of nearly 8 feet. A small aperture has been cut near the top to allow smoke to escape, while a larger opening, fitted with a door constructed of bark panels and secured with wooden hinges, provides access. The inhabitant of the largest stump dwelling refused conversation, Blackburn wrote elsewhere in his field journal. When approached, he retreated inside and secured what appeared to be a door fashioned from bark and sinew. The interior, glimpsed briefly, contained personal effects arranged with a precision that seemed at odds with the crude nature of the shelter. Blackburn noted that the man watched him with an intensity that provoked discomfort from a small window cut into the stump wall. What Blackburn found particularly noteworthy was the spatial arrangement within these dwellings. Objects within are positioned according to some system I cannot discern, not for convenience or accessibility, but in patterns that suggest ritualistic significance. Tools, foodstuffs, and personal items are aligned along invisible radii emanating from the center of the space, creating a spiraling effect that draws the eye inward and downward. This last observation would prove prescient, as later investigations would reveal that many stump houses contained entrances to subterranean chambers directly beneath their central points, though Blackburn himself does not appear to have discovered these lower levels. What Blackburn could not have known was that he had documented the beginning of a pattern that would persist in the region for nearly 50 years. A pattern that local authorities would eventually go to considerable lengths to erase from public memory. The winter of 1892 was particularly harsh in the mountains. Snow began falling in early November and didn't fully retreat until late March. It was during this period that the first disappearances occurred. 3 men from the mining settlement of Colwood ventured into the forest to hunt deer in late December. Only one returned, a man named Silas Morton, who was found wandering along a creek bed, severely frostbitten and unable, or unwilling, to account for his companions. According to the medical report filed by Dr. James Harland of the Colwood Company Hospital, Morton refused to speak for 3 days. When he finally broke his silence, he described becoming separated from his hunting partners during a sudden snowstorm. Morton claimed to have sought refuge in what he described as a home made from a tree, where a man gave me shelter. His account becomes fragmented after this point, with references to strange sounds and things hanging from the ceiling that the doctor attributed to feverish hallucinations brought on by his exposure to the elements. The hospital records, accessed by historian Margaret Whittaker before being sealed in 1961, contain several unusual notations regarding Morton's condition. Dr. Harland observed that Morton's hands exhibited a peculiar texture similar to tree bark, particularly on the palms and fingertips. He attributed this to frostbite and exposure, noting that such dermal abnormalities sometimes occurred in individuals subjected to extreme cold. More concerning was Harland's observation regarding Morton's mental state. Patient exhibits periods of lucidity interrupted by episodes during which he speaks in a manner suggesting entrained patterns, repeating phrases with a rhythmic quality that resembles the rings of tree growth in its circular, accretive nature. When asked direct questions about his experience, he frequently responds with the statement, "What's below stays below," a phrase he delivers with unusual emphasis. The other hunters were never found, though spring thaws typically revealed the remains of those who succumbed to winter in the mountains. No search party was organized, unusual for the time, as communities typically mounted extensive efforts to recover their dead. The Colwood Company records, accessed in 1961 by historian Margaret Whittaker before being sealed by the state, indicate that the mining operation was short-handed that winter and could not spare the men for a search deemed unlikely to succeed. Morton never fully reintegrated into the community. According to tax records and employment logs, he left Colwood in the spring of 1893 and established a solitary residence in the forest approximately 7 miles from the settlement. No record of his life exists after this point, though his name appears on a list of forest dwellers compiled by the McDowell County Sheriff's Office in 1897, a list that also contains the first official use of the term stumpmen to describe individuals living in converted tree stumps. By 1897, local newspapers had begun to take note of an unusual demographic trend. The Welch Daily News published an article titled "Mountain Men: The Solitary Lives of Those Who Dwell Among Stumps." The piece described a loose community of individuals, all male, who had taken to living in isolation in the remote forest areas that had been cleared by logging operations. These men appear to subsist primarily through trapping and foraging, the article stated. They maintain minimal contact with settlements, emerging only to trade furs and ginseng root for essential supplies. They are known to be territorial and unwelcoming to strangers who approach their dwellings. The newspaper account makes no mention of the disappearances, which by this point numbered 7 individuals over a 5-year period, according to county records that were later collected and analyzed in a 1958 West Virginia University study that was never formally published. What the newspaper did report, however, was the distinctive nature of these habitations. The dwellings are fashioned with surprising ingenuity from the stumps of enormous trees left behind by lumber operations. The men have hollowed these natural structures and adapted them with fitted doors, small windows, and even crude chimneys that allow for fires within. Some have been observed to have multiple levels, with storage areas dug beneath the main living space. The article goes on to describe how these stump dwellers were viewed with suspicion by local communities. The people of nearby settlements regard these solitary men with a mixture of pity and unease. They are said to develop odd mannerisms after prolonged isolation, including peculiar speech patterns, and an aversion to direct eye contact. The journalist, identified only as E.M. One man who identified himself only as Coulter stated that he preferred the solitude of the forest because the mountains speak more truth than men. When asked about his unusual dwelling, he replied that the tree remembers what stood here before, a statement he declined to clarify. Hawkins noted that many of the men exhibited unusual physical characteristics. Their skin, particularly on the hands and face, possesses a texture reminiscent of bark, a condition I initially attributed to exposure and poor hygiene, but which appears consistent across individuals regardless of their apparent age or duration of forest habitation. The most disturbing observation came at the conclusion of the article. I inquired of Coulter what had drawn him to this isolated existence. Hawkins attempted to interview several stump dwellers, but reported limited success. Those who would speak to me did so briefly and with evident reluctance. His response, delivered after a long pause, during which he seemed to listen to something I could not hear, has remained with me. There's something under these mountains that's older than the mountains themselves. Once you hear it calling, you can't unhear it. When I asked what this something might be, he retreated into his dwelling and would not emerge again, despite my repeated inquiries. A follow-up article planned by Hawkins never appeared in the newspaper. According to employment records, he left the Welch Daily News 2 weeks after the Stump Dwellers piece was published. No record of his subsequent employment or residence in McDowell County exists. A brief item in the newspaper's April 14, 1897 edition noted simply that E.M. Hawkins, formerly of this publication, has relocated to pursue other opportunities. What happened in the spring of 1901 transformed local wariness into outright fear. A family of settlers, the Caldwells, established a homestead in a valley that had previously been logged but was considered too remote for typical settlement. Their nearest neighbors were 4 miles away, and the closest stump dweller was believed to reside approximately 2 miles into the surrounding forest. After the Caldwells failed to appear at the general store in Panther for their monthly supply run, the shopkeeper, William Tate, noted their absence in his ledger. 2 more weeks passed before a local trapper, Ezekiel Davis, decided to check on the family. What he discovered at the homestead was described in his subsequent statement to the McDowell County Sheriff's Office. The cabin appeared undisturbed from the outside, Davis testified, according to transcripts preserved in county court records. No signs of forced entry or struggle were visible. Inside, I found the dwelling to be empty of persons, though all belongings remained in place. A meal appeared to have been abandoned during preparation. The fire had long since gone cold, but a pot still hung over the hearth. The most peculiar aspect was the absence of any tracks leading away from the cabin, save for a single set that approached from and returned to the direction of the deep woods. The sheriff's investigation concluded that the family had likely abandoned the homestead, despite leaving all their possessions behind. This explanation was accepted officially but rejected by locals. What the official report omitted, but which appears in Davis's complete statement, portions of which were redacted in public records but preserved in his personal journal, later donated to the McDowell County Historical Society, was his discovery of unusual markings on the cabin's dirt floor. Beneath the table, I observed what appeared to be a pattern pressed into the earth, a spiral shape approximately 3 feet in diameter, with smaller circles positioned at various points along its curve. Most disturbing was the fact that, at the center of this spiral, the dirt appeared to have been deliberately excavated to a depth of approximately 6 inches, creating a small pit that contained nothing but a single tree root of unusual form, twisted in a manner suggesting deliberate shaping. Davis also noted that the single set of tracks leading to and from the cabin displayed an unusual characteristic. The footprints, while human in general shape, exhibited a texture in their impression suggesting that the individual who made them wore coverings fashioned from tree bark rather than conventional footwear. Rumors began to spread about the Stump men, and their possible involvement in the Caldwell's disappearance. The impression was shallow but precise, as if made by a tool rather than footprints or disturbed soil. The stride length indicated a person of above-average height moving with deliberate purpose rather than haste. In the years that followed, a pattern emerged. Homesteaders who established residences too close to what locals now called Stump territory would either abandon their claims within a year or simply vanish. By 1907, county maps had been redrawn with certain valleys and hollows designated as unsuitable for settlement, areas that coincided with the highest concentration of documented stump houses. These designations were officially attributed to unstable soil conditions, poor water access, or susceptibility to flooding. However, internal correspondence between the McDowell County Surveyor's Office and the State Land Management Bureau, preserved in state archives and discovered by researchers in 1964, reveals a different rationale. Areas marked in red on the attached map should be discouraged from settlement due to persistent difficulties with existing residents. The nature of these difficulties need not be detailed in public documents, but it is the consensus of local authorities that further encroachment into these regions would be detrimental to public order and safety. The most comprehensive account of the stump houses themselves comes from an unlikely source. Alistair Montgomery, a botanist from the University of Pennsylvania, who visited the region in 1912 to study the regrowth patterns in areas subjected to extensive logging. Montgomery's field notes, preserved in the university archives and examined by researchers in 1965, contain detailed observations of these unusual dwellings. The craftsmanship evident in these structures defies their crude appearance, Montgomery wrote. The interior of the specimen I was permitted to examine had been smoothed and shaped with exceptional skill. The contours of the living space followed the natural rings of the tree, creating a spiral effect that the inhabitant had accentuated by arranging his sparse belongings in a similar pattern. Montgomery was particularly struck by the acoustics within the stump house. When standing inside, sounds from the forest are amplified and seem to come from all directions at once. The inhabitant, who identified himself only as Marsh, claimed this feature allowed him to detect approaching visitors long before they arrived. This may explain the uncanny awareness these men seem to have of anyone entering their vicinity. The botanist also documented unusual modifications to the structures. Many of the stump houses have been expanded downward, with the residents excavating beneath the root systems to create additional chambers. Marsh would not permit me to examine these lower spaces, becoming agitated when I inquired about them. He stated only that what's below stays below, and suggested I conclude my visit. Montgomery's scientific training led him to document specific details that might have escaped other observers. He noted that the interior surfaces of the stump dwelling had been treated with a substance resembling a mixture of tree resin and ash, creating a waterproof coating that also serves to preserve the wood against decay. He collected samples of this material, which laboratory analysis later identified as containing compounds not typically found in local tree species, including several organic components that could not be identified using the chemical techniques available in 1912. Of particular interest was Montgomery's observation regarding the growth patterns of vegetation surrounding the stump houses. Plants within a radius of approximately 20 feet from each structure display unusual characteristics: accelerated growth rates, morphological variations, and a tendency to orient themselves toward the stump rather than toward sunlight, as would be expected. Most striking are the fungi, which proliferate in species-diverse colonies around the bases of these dwellings, including several varieties I have not encountered elsewhere in the region and cannot identify through reference to existing mycological texts. Montgomery's account includes the only known conversation with a stump dweller that was documented at length. He described Marsh as a man of approximately 50 years, though exposure to the elements had weathered him considerably. He spoke with an unusual cadence, elongating certain words and rushing through others, as if his solitary existence had altered his perception of how language should flow. When asked why he chose to live in such isolation, Marsh reportedly replied, "The mountains keep what's put in them. They hold things that shouldn't be let loose." Some of us understand that better than others. When pressed for clarification, he would only add, "There are older things than trees in these hills." Montgomery attempted to inquire about the subterranean expansions he had observed. I asked Marsh about the purpose of the excavations beneath his dwelling, noting that they appeared too extensive for simple storage. His response was cryptic, but delivered with an intensity that suggested profound significance. "We dig to listen better. The deeper you go, the clearer it speaks." When I inquired what "it" might be, he studied me for a moment before replying, "If I told you, you'd either think me mad or you'd want to hear for yourself. Neither would serve you well." The botanist's final observation concerned the physical appearance of the stump dwellers. All of the individuals I encountered exhibited similar dermal abnormalities, specifically a textural alteration of the skin that renders it remarkably similar to tree bark, particularly on the hands, forearms, neck, and portions of the face. This condition appears to be progressive, with older inhabitants displaying more extensive manifestations. When I inquired about this condition, suggesting it might result from environmental exposure or nutritional factors, Marsh responded with what seemed to be amusement. "It's not something that happens to us, it's something we become." Montgomery's account stands out not only for its detail, but for the fact that it exists at all. Between 1915 and 1927, county records show 17 separate missing persons cases associated with the remote areas of McDowell County. None of these investigations produced substantive documentation, and in most instances, the files contain only initial reports, followed by abrupt closures with no resolution noted. One such case, the disappearance of mining engineer Howard Phillips in 1918, is notable for the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. Phillips had been assigned to survey a potential new mining site near an area known locally as the Deep, a valley with a high concentration of stump dwellings. According to his assistant, Samuel Thorne, whose statement appears in county records, Phillips had expressed unease about the assignment. Mr. Phillips had been studying old survey maps of the region for several weeks, Thorne testified. He had identified what he called anomalous subterranean features that did not correspond to known geological formations. The night before we were to begin fieldwork, he showed me several maps on which he had marked spiral patterns that he claimed represented a network of tunnels not created by natural processes or conventional mining. He was particularly concerned about one area where these patterns appeared to converge beneath a ridge approximately 2 miles from our intended survey site. When Phillips failed to return from a preliminary reconnaissance, a search party was organized, unusual given the Iawi pattern of administrative indifference to previous disappearances. The search focused not on the survey site, but on an area several miles distant, where the highest concentration of stump houses had been reported. According to Thorne's account, portions of which were redacted in official records, but preserved in his personal correspondence, later donated to the West Virginia Historical Society, the search party discovered Phillips's equipment scattered around the base of a large stump dwelling. His transit, notebook, and personal effects had been arranged in a precise circular pattern, Thorne wrote in a letter to Phillips's wife. The stump itself showed signs of recent modification, fresh tool marks around an opening in its base that appeared to lead downward into the earth. Several members of the search party wished to investigate this opening, but the county sheriff, who had accompanied us, expressly forbade any approach to the structure. He ordered us to collect Phillips's belongings and return to town immediately, stating that further search would be conducted by more appropriate personnel. To my knowledge, no such search ever took place. This pattern of administrative silence was broken briefly in 1931, when a state police detective named Raymond Harker was assigned to investigate the disappearance of 2 geological surveyors working for a coal company. Harker's investigation, unlike those before it, was methodical and extensive. His reports, which span more than 30 pages, were filed with both the state police and the McDowell County Courthouse. By 1963, however, these documents had been removed from public access and were only rediscovered during a courthouse renovation in 1958, after which they were promptly reclassified and restricted. A clerk who had access to these files before their reclassification described their contents to local historian Elijah Whitaker, son of the previously mentioned Margaret Whitaker, in a recorded interview conducted in 1967. According to this account, Harker tracked the movements of the surveyors to an area known locally as the Deep, a particularly isolated valley where at least 7 stump houses had been documented. Detective Harker reported finding one of the survey team's equipment caches, the clerk recalled. The instruments had been arranged in a circular pattern around the base of a large stump dwelling. Inside the dwelling, he discovered maps belonging to the surveyors that had been modified with markings in a substance he initially believed to be red clay, but later suspected was blood. Harker's investigation led him to interview residents of the nearest settlement, a small mining community called Beartown. These interviews revealed that the inhabitants maintained an unspoken agreement with the stump dwellers. They would not venture into certain areas of the forest, and in exchange, they would be left alone. Folks here know better than to go up beyond Sawyer's Ridge after sundown, one resident told Harker, according to the clerk's recollection of the files. Those men in the stumps, they weren't always like they are now. Something in those woods changed them. Something they found under the roots, where it's dark all the time. The most detailed of these interviews was with an elderly resident named Jeremiah Coulter, who claimed to have encountered stump dwellers on multiple occasions over a period of 40 years. Coulter described the witnessing their physical transformation. When they first go to live in the stumps, they look like ordinary men. But after a time, maybe a year, maybe less, their skin starts to change, gets rough and dark like bark. Their eyes change too, not the color, but the way they look at things, like they're seeing something the rest of us can't. And they start to move different, slower and more deliberate, like they're listening to something all the time. Coulter also provided Harker with information about the activities of the stump dwellers. They spend most of their time digging, not like miners looking for coal, but like they're making pathways to somewhere. I followed one once, keeping my distance, and watched him for most of a day. He was extending a tunnel from beneath his dwelling, reinforcing it with roots and branches woven together in patterns I've never seen in any kind of construction. When he stopped to rest, he would press his ear against the earth, like he was listening for something deep below. Most disturbing was Coulter's account of an encounter with a long-term stump dweller. There was an old man who lived in the biggest stump up near Sawyer's Ridge. Must have been there 20 years or more. His skin was so like tree bark, you'd mistake him for a part of the stump if he stood still. I came across him one day while hunting, and he beckoned me closer. He wanted to show me something, he said. He led me to his dwelling and pointed to an opening in the floor, a hole that led down into darkness. Listen, he told me. So I knelt and put my ear to the opening. At first, I heard nothing. Then I began to make out a sound like water flowing, but not quite, more like a liquid thicker than water, moving slowly, and beneath that something else. A rhythm, like a heartbeat, but not regular. It would speed up and slow down in patterns that made no sense. I listened for maybe 2 minutes before I started to feel strange, lightheaded and confused, like the sound was somehow getting inside me. I pulled away, and the old man was watching me with an expression I can only describe as hungry. "It knows you now," he said. I left immediately and never went back to that part of the forest. Harker reportedly spent 3 weeks attempting to locate and interview the stump dwellers themselves, but was unsuccessful. In his final report, he noted, "These individuals demonstrate an uncanny ability to avoid contact when sought. On several occasions, I located stump dwellings that showed signs of recent habitation, still warm ashes, fresh animal remains, yet the occupants were nowhere to be found." On 2 separate nights while camping near these structures, I observed lights moving through the forest in patterns that defied explanation as they traversed terrain that would be impassable in darkness. The most disturbing element of Harker's investigation, according to the clerk's account, was his discovery of a larger stump dwelling that appeared to serve as a central gathering place. The interior walls were covered with hundreds of small objects suspended from pins, items that appeared to be personal effects, pocket watches, eyeglasses, wedding bands, hair combs, and other such possessions. Detective Harker recognized several items as belonging to individuals reported missing over the previous decade. Within this structure, Harker discovered a journal written by someone identifying themselves only as the listener. The document, portions of which were transcribed in Harker's report, contained entries spanning nearly 15 years. The writing began in a conventional style but gradually deteriorated into an almost incomprehensible mixture of standard English phonetic spellings and symbolic notations. Early entries describe the author's discovery of a network of chambers deep beneath the mountain, and their decision to establish a dwelling above what they termed a primary access point. Subsequent writings documented the author's progressive physical transformation. My hands have begun to change. The skin is hardening, developing textures similar to the inner bark of oak. The sensation is not unpleasant, rather it feels appropriate, as if my body is adapting to better serve its purpose. Later entries became increasingly abstract. The voice from below grows stronger. It speaks in rhythms that alter thought. The tunnels must be extended according to the patterns it provides. We are many now, working in concert, though each hears a slightly different aspect of the whole. What we create beneath mirrors what exists above but inverted, like a reflection in still water. The final pages, nearly illegible due to the deterioration of the author's handwriting into abstract symbols, contained a passage that Harker found particularly troubling. We are becoming conduits. The spaces we hollow from earth and wood create channels through which it can extend its awareness. Each new tunnel, each modified stump, each converted human serves to amplify its reach. Soon the network will be sufficient to permit more direct communion. What has been confined will find new vessels. Harker requested reinforcements to conduct a more thorough search of the area and proposed detaining any stump dwellers encountered for questioning. His request was denied by the McDowell County Sheriff, who cited resource limitations. 3 days after filing his report, Harker himself disappeared while returning to the area for one final attempt to make contact with the stump dwellers. The official record states that Detective Harker was presumed to have fallen from one of the steep ridges in the area, though no body was ever recovered. His disappearance marked a turning point in official attitudes toward the stump houses phenomenon. Rather than prompting a larger investigation, it resulted in what appears to have been a coordinated effort to minimize public awareness of the situation. Between 1932 and 1938, local newspapers contained no mention of either the stump houses or the disappearances. County maps were revised to mark certain areas simply as watershed protection zones, rather than acknowledging the unofficial boundaries of stump dweller territory. When disappearances occurred, they were attributed to mining accidents, flash floods, or individuals leaving the area due to economic hardship during the Depression. This period of official silence coincided with the most intense phase of stump house construction and occupation, according to Forest Service surveys conducted years later. Aerial photographs taken by the U.S. Geological Survey in 1940 revealed over 30 such structures in the most remote regions of McDowell County, a significant increase from the dozen or so documented in the previous decades. What makes this expansion particularly notable is that it occurred during a time when the regional population was declining sharply due to mine closures and economic migration. While families were leaving the mountains in search of work elsewhere, the population of solitary men in the forests was growing. The nature of this growth, who these men were and where they came from, remains one of the most troubling aspects of the phenomenon. County birth and death records show no corresponding increase in the male population, and census data from the period indicates a net loss of residents. The implication, never officially acknowledged, is that the Stump dweller population was being augmented by individuals from outside the region who were drawn to the area for unknown reasons. A partial explanation may lie in an unusual pattern noted in employment records from regional mining operations. Between 1928 and 1935, several companies reported elevated rates of sudden resignation among workers assigned to the deepest shaft operations. One company, the Beartown Coal and Coke Corporation, documented this trend in an internal memorandum discovered during bankruptcy proceedings in 1941. Men assigned to the new Western Shaft have exhibited an unusually high rate of departure without notice, 27 individuals over the past 8 months. Most concerning is that these resignations typically occur within days of the workers' first descent to the lowest levels, where extraction operations have encountered unusual geological formations not consistent with typical coal seam structures. The memorandum goes on to note that several of these former employees had been observed taking up residence in remote forest areas, particularly those containing the large stumps left by earlier timbering operations. The document recommends against pursuing these individuals for breach of contract, stating that attempts to recover company property from these men have proven unsuccessful and potentially dangerous as they display hostile and erratic behavior when approached. The most significant breach in the wall of silence surrounding the Stump houses came in 1943, when a folklorist named Eleanor Marsh, no relation to the Stump dweller previously mentioned, visited the region to document Appalachian music traditions. During her stay in the town of Eager, Marsh became aware of local superstitions regarding the remote forests and the men who lived there. In her field journal, later published as part of a collection of Appalachian folklore by the University of Virginia in 1951, Marsh recounted conversations with residents who spoke of the Stump men in hushed tones. A local preacher described them as having turned away from the light in favor of what grows in the dark places. When I inquired about the nature of this transformation, my informants became reticent, though one elderly woman told me that when they go to live in the stumps, they start by hollowing out the wood and end by hollowing out themselves. Marsh documented several local folk practices developed specifically in response to the Stump dwellers, residents of areas bordering. The deep forests maintain a variety of protective rituals. They told me these men were not simply hermits or outcasts, she wrote, but individuals who had undergone a transformation after extended periods in the deep forests. Many refused to build homes with wooden floors directly contacting the earth, instead elevating structures on stone foundations. Doorways and windows are often marked with spiral patterns carved in reverse of those reportedly found in stump houses, which locals believe prevents the influence of the forest from entering their homes. She also recorded songs and stories that referenced the phenomenon, including a ballad called The Hollow Man that described a miner who went too deep and heard the old voice calling before abandoning his family to live in a stump where he dug a path to something down below. The song concludes with a warning to avoid the deep woods where men's skin turns to bark and their hearts turn to wood. Marsh's attempt to learn more was met with increasing resistance from both locals and officials. The county clerk refused to provide access to land records, and the sheriff suggested she focus her research on more appropriate cultural elements. After receiving what she described as a warning delivered not as a threat but as genuine concern for my welfare, Marsh abandoned her inquiry into the stump houses and returned to her original research focus. However, her journal contains one final entry on the subject, dated April 18, 1943. Mr. Cahill, the hotel proprietor, visited my room this evening in a state of considerable distress. He informed me that a man had been asking after me at local establishments, a thin, weathered individual who did not identify himself, but who carried a walking stick made from a twisted root. The man reportedly inquired about the nature of my research and examined pages of my notes that I had unfortunately left unattended in the hotel lobby. Mr. Cahill advised that I conclude my business in the area as quickly as possible. I have decided to heed his advice. What Marsh's published journal omits, but which appears in her personal correspondence, preserved in the University of Virginia's archival collection, is her final encounter before leaving the region. In a letter to her academic supervisor, she wrote, "On the morning of my departure, as I waited for the bus that would carry me from Yeager, I observed a man standing at the edge of the forest that borders the town. Even at a distance, I could discern the bark-like texture of his skin and the unnatural stillness with which he maintained his position. He remained there, watching, until the moment the bus arrived, at which point he raised one hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or warning. Most disturbing was my certainty, despite the considerable distance between us, that his eyes were fixed directly on mine throughout the entire 20-minute vigil." Marsh's account represents the last substantive documentation of the Stump houses phenomenon by an outside observer for nearly 15 years. During this period, local records show a steady decline in reported missing persons cases, dropping from an average of 3 per year in the 1930s to less than 1 per year by the early 1950s. This decline coincided with increased development in the region as new mining operations opened and roads were improved, reducing the isolation of once remote areas. The winter of 1953 brought an unusual incident that briefly returned attention to the Stump dwellers. When telephone service was restored, the local doctor, William Hartley, requested immediate assistance from the state police, reporting what he described as multiple injuries resulting from confrontation with forest dwellers. According to the official report, filed by State Trooper Marcus Collins, and later accessed by researchers before being restricted, Hartley had treated 6 men for lacerations, contusions, and exposure, following what they described as an attack by Stump men who had entered the town during the height of the storm. A severe storm with heavy snowfall isolated the small community of Roderfield for nearly a week. The injured parties claimed they had confronted a group of strange individuals observed moving through town in the pre-dawn hours. The men stated that they had noticed unusual footprints in the snow leading from the forest edge to several homes, Collins wrote. Upon following these tracks, they encountered 5 or 6 individuals of unusual appearance, specifically men whose skin exhibited a texture described as bark-like and who moved with deliberate, synchronized motions. When confronted, these individuals allegedly became hostile, though the nature of the ensuing conflict remains unclear in the report. The Roderfield men claimed they had driven the intruders back into the forest, but had been injured in the process. None of the purported Stump dwellers was apprehended or injured severely enough to leave blood traces in the snow. Most curious was Hartley's medical observation, included as an addendum to Collins's report. The injuries sustained by these men are inconsistent with their account of physical confrontation. The lacerations exhibit patterns suggesting contact with sharp, splinter-like objects rather than blades or blunt force. Most notable is the presence of foreign material in the wounds, specifically fragments of what appears to be wood embedded so deeply in the tissue that complete extraction proved impossible in several cases. Collins concluded his report with a recommendation that the incident be investigated further, particularly given the unusual circumstances and the fact that several residents reported items missing from their homes following the alleged incursion, primarily maps, compasses, and timepieces. No such investigation was ever conducted, according to available records. The final chapter of the Stump houses story begins in 1957, when the U.S. Forest Service conducted a comprehensive survey of federal lands in the region, including areas that had previously been difficult to access. The survey team, led by Robert Caldwell, no relation to the vanished family, was tasked with assessing forest regrowth and identifying areas for potential conservation efforts. Caldwell's team discovered that the Stump houses were no longer occupied. The structures remained, some in remarkably preserved condition, but showed no signs of recent habitation. In his report, filed with the Department of Agriculture and accessed by researchers in 1967, Caldwell noted, "These dwellings appear to have been abandoned simultaneously rather than gradually. Fire pits contain ash from fires that were not burned down to embers, but extinguished suddenly. Personal effects remain in place, including items of value that would typically be taken if the departure had been planned." The survey team documented 17 intact stump houses and evidence of at least 10 more that had collapsed or been deliberately destroyed. The most notable finding, however, was the discovery of extensive tunnel systems beneath many of the structures. The inhabitants appear to have expanded their dwellings downward to a remarkable degree, Caldwell wrote. In several instances, tunnels radiate outward from the central stump in patterns that defy practical explanation. These passages are too narrow for easy human traversal and follow no discernible logic in their direction or destination. Most troubling is the fact that these tunnel systems appear to connect multiple stump dwellings, despite distances of up to half a mile separating them on the surface. One member of Caldwell's survey team, geologist Howard Phillips, documented the unusual nature of these excavations in his personal field journal, which was later donated to the West Virginia Historical Society by his widow in 1965. Phillips noted that the tunnels did not appear to have been created using conventional mining techniques familiar to the region. The walls of these passages bear marks unlike those produced by picks or shovels, Phillips wrote. Rather, they appear to have been hollowed out using a twisting, boring motion that left spiral patterns in the soil and underlying rock. The precision of these markings suggests a tool of unusual design, yet we discovered no implements that could have produced such effects. Phillips also observed that the tunnels appeared to follow specific geological features invisible from the surface. In several instances, the passages track precisely along the boundaries between different soil types or rock formations. This would require knowledge that could only be obtained through extensive underground exploration or an uncanny sense for subterranean composition. Most disturbing was Phillips's observation regarding the direction of these tunnel systems. While the passages appear initially random in their layout, careful mapping reveals that they all ultimately tend toward a central point deep beneath Sawyer's Ridge. This convergence cannot be coincidental and suggests a communal effort directed toward some specific underground location. Phillips's journal also contains a detailed account of one particular tunnel exploration that was omitted from the official survey report. On our third day of mapping the subsurface network, Johnson, Martinez, and I followed what appeared to be a primary passage extending beneath Sawyer's Ridge. The tunnel descended at a consistent 15-degree angle for approximately 800 feet, before opening into a chamber of considerable size, an estimated 30 feet in diameter and nearly 20 feet in height at its center. The chamber's walls displayed the same spiral boring marks noted in the connecting tunnels, but executed with greater precision and forming patterns that appeared deliberate rather than merely functional. Most striking was the floor of the chamber, which had been shaped into a perfect spiral pattern that descended toward a central point like a gently sloping amphitheater. At the center of this spiral was a circular opening approximately 3 feet in diameter, descending vertically into darkness. When we directed our lights into this shaft, we could discern no bottom despite the considerable power of our lamps. A curious acoustic property became apparent when we spoke near this opening. Our voices produced echoes that returned altered in pitch and duration, creating an effect Martinez described as conversational, as if something below were responding. Most troubling was the discovery of unusual growths around the perimeter of the chamber, fungi of a variety none of us recognized, displaying bioluminescent properties and arranged in patterns identical to those we had observed carved into the walls of the stump houses above. These organisms emitted a scent that Johnson described as intensely earthy but with chemical undertones, like petrichor mixed with something metallic. After approximately 20 minutes in the chamber, all three of us began to experience symptoms of discomfort, specifically vertigo, confusion, and what I can only describe as auditory hallucinations, the impression of whispered voices emanating from the central shaft. By mutual agreement, we decided to return to the surface. Upon emerging, all symptoms dissipated within minutes, suggesting their cause was environmental rather than psychological. Phillips's journal indicates that he reported these findings to Caldwell, who ordered the tunnel entrance sealed and omitted the discovery from the official survey documentation. Phillips notes his disagreement with this decision, but speculates that considerations beyond the scientific appear to be influencing our reporting parameters. Caldwell's team explored several of these tunnels, but was limited by safety concerns and inadequate equipment. They did, however, collect numerous artifacts from both the Stump houses and the tunnel systems. These items, along with photographs and detailed maps, were sent to the Department of Agriculture's regional office in Charleston. Among the artifacts recovered were several journals belonging to Stump dwellers, written in a nearly illegible script that combined standard English with what appeared to be a personalized code or symbolic language. Department linguists attempted to decipher these writings without success. The journals were subsequently transferred to the Smithsonian Institution for further study, but were reportedly lost in transit. No record of their arrival exists in Smithsonian archives. Photographs taken by the survey team show interiors of Stump houses arranged in concentric patterns, with furniture and personal effects positioned precisely along what Phillips described as radiating lines emanating from central points in the floor, the entrances to the tunnel systems. These images, preserved in the West Virginia State Archives, reveal dwellings that appear at once primitive and meticulously organized, suggesting a ritualistic aspect to their arrangement. One photograph, which Phillips referenced specifically in his journal, but which is notably absent from the archival collection, reportedly showed unusual modifications to the interior surface of the largest Stump dwelling, specifically a series of protrusions extending from the walls in spiral patterns, which appear to have been cultivated rather than carved. The material resembles wood, but displays growth patterns inconsistent with normal tree physiology, suggesting deliberate manipulation of the living tissue before the tree was felled, creating structures that continued to develop after the stump was converted to a dwelling. Within 6 months of the survey's completion, a forest fire swept through the area containing the highest concentration of Stump houses. The fire was attributed to a lightning strike, though local reports indicate the weather had been clear in the days preceding the blaze. The fire burned with unusual intensity, centered precisely on the area documented in Caldwell's survey. When Forest Service personnel returned to assess the damage, they found that the fire had destroyed all evidence of the Stump houses. Even the massive stumps themselves, which should have been only partially consumed given their size and moisture content, had been reduced to ash. The entrances to the tunnel systems had collapsed or were filled with debris, rendering them inaccessible. A Forest Service investigator named William Hayes filed an internal report questioning the official explanation for the fire. This document, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request by researchers in 1968, contains Hayes's observation that the pattern of burning suggests multiple points of origin rather than a single lightning strike. Furthermore, the intensity of the fire appears to have been greatest directly above the locations of the subterranean passages, as if the fire had been specifically intended to seal these openings. Hayes recommended a more thorough investigation of the incident, but was reassigned to a national forest in Oregon shortly after submitting his report. No further inquiry into the cause of the fire was conducted. In the aftermath of the fire, official interest in the phenomenon waned rapidly. Caldwell's report was filed away. The artifacts collected were placed in storage, and the area was designated for reforestation. By 1963, the entire collection of physical evidence, along with most of the documentation accumulated over the previous 70 years, had been either misplaced, reclassified, or destroyed in what was described as a routine archival purge. The Stump houses might have faded completely from historical record if not for a graduate student named David Harker, grandson of the missing detective, who began researching his grandfather's disappearance in 1967. Harker's inquiries led him through a labyrinth of redacted documents, restricted files, and reluctant witnesses. His thesis, titled Administrative Erasure, the Case of the McDowell County Stump Dwellers, was submitted to West Virginia University's History Department in 1968 but was never published. Harker's academic advisor, Dr. Martin Sloan, later revealed in a private correspondence that the university had received significant pressure from multiple governmental agencies to suppress the work. Harker was granted his degree, but was advised to pursue other research interests if he wished to advance academically. During his research, Harker interviewed several elderly residents of McDowell County who had lived in the region during the height of the Stump Houses phenomenon. Simmons claimed that in 1937 his company had attempted to extend a mine shaft into an area near what locals called Stump territory. After breaking through a seam of coal, the miners discovered a natural cavity containing what Simmons described as a perfectly smooth wall of some dark material, neither rock nor metal, with markings like writing, but in no language any of us recognized. According to Simmons, the company geologist photographed these markings and sent the images to the company's head office in Pittsburgh. One such individual, Edgar Simmons, who had worked as a mining engineer in the 1930s, provided a particularly disturbing account that did not appear in Harker's thesis, but was documented in his research notes. 3 days later, government officials arrived and sealed the shaft. The miners were reassigned to different sections of the mine, and the incident was never officially acknowledged. The strangest thing, Simmons told Harker, was what happened to Jacob Myers, the man who first touched that wall. Within a week, he'd quit his job and moved into the deep forest. Last I heard, he was living in one of them stump houses, but that wasn't the Jacob I knew. Something changed in him when he put his hand on that surface. His eyes went different somehow, like they were seeing things the rest of us couldn't. The most disturbing aspect of Harker's research was not what he discovered about the stump houses themselves, but what he learned about the men who inhabited them. Through painstaking analysis of census records, employment logs from mining companies, and local church registries, Harker determined that many of the stump dwellers had previously led normal lives in local communities before suddenly withdrawing to the forests. These were not always isolated hermits or social outcasts, Harker wrote. Many had been miners, loggers, farmers, and shopkeepers, men with families and social connections who, at some point, made a decisive break with their established lives. In several instances, this transition occurred after these individuals were involved in the deeper mining operations that began to penetrate previously untapped coal seams in the 1880s. Harker identified a particular mining disaster as a potential catalyst. In 1883, miners breaking through to a new seam in the Bald Knob operation near Beartown reported breaching what they described as a hollow space within the mountain, not formed by any human tool. The unusual cavity reportedly contained formations of an unidentifiable type, neither stone nor metal, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Within 6 months of this discovery, 3 miners who had been present during the breach had abandoned their homes and families to establish residences in remote forest areas. They were among the first documented stump dwellers. Harker's research suggested a troubling pattern. Those who encountered whatever lay beneath the mountains were fundamentally changed by the experience. This transformation drove them to the isolation of the forests, where they constructed their unusual dwellings and began the excavations beneath them, as if attempting to recreate or return to what they had discovered below the earth. Harker also uncovered evidence of unusual physical changes reported in men who had taken up residence in stump houses. Medical records from the Coalwood Company Hospital, examined before their subsequent restriction, contained references to former miners who had been treated for injuries after leaving the company's employment. Dr. Harland, the physician who had treated Silas Morton after his traumatic hunting experience, noted in one such record, "Patient exhibits unusual dermal abnormalities, specifically a hardening and darkening of the skin on the palms and fingertips, which now display a bark-like texture." When questioned about this condition, he became agitated and refused further examination. Similar observations appear in scattered medical records throughout the period, describing individuals associated with stump dwellings as developing arboreal characteristics or integumentary changes resembling the composition of tree bark. These reports were typically dismissed as the results of poor hygiene, environmental exposure, or occupational callousing common to those who worked with their hands. Eleanor Blackwood, who examined tissue samples from a deceased stump dweller in 1944, noted in her private correspondence, later donated to the university's medical archives, that the cellular structure of the affected tissue suggests not a topical accumulation of callus or foreign material, but an actual transformation of the epidermis at the cellular level, a phenomenon I cannot explain through any known medical process. Perhaps most significant was Blackwood's observation that the affected tissue contained cellular structures that do not correspond to any known human dermatological condition or pathogen. However, a pathologist from Johns Hopkins University doctored these structures resemble plant cells in some respects but display chromosomal arrangements unlike anything in the botanical literature. Most concerning is their apparent integration with the surrounding human tissue, suggesting not an infection but a symbiotic relationship or, more disturbingly, a progressive replacement of human cellular material with this unidentified biological component. Blackwood's findings were never published in any medical journal, and her requests for further samples or permission to conduct additional research were denied. According to her correspondence, she was visited by government representatives who confiscated her existing samples and notes, citing concerns about potential public health implications. She was advised to discontinue her inquiries and focus on her primary research areas. The final pages of Harker's thesis contain his most speculative but unsettling conclusion. The stump houses were not simply dwellings, but way stations, transitional spaces between the world above and something else below. The men who occupied these structures were not merely hermits, but sentinels or converts, drawn to and transformed by something ancient that resides beneath the mountains of Appalachia. Harker's work represents the last serious academic inquiry into the stump houses. In the decades since, the phenomenon has been relegated to local folklore, occasionally resurfacing in collections of Appalachian legends or accounts of regional hauntings. The factual basis of these stories has been progressively obscured by embellishment and the passage of time. Yet physical evidence of the stump houses persists. Hikers and hunters occasionally report finding remnants of these structures in the most isolated sections of what is now the Monongahela National Forest. Forest Service employees acknowledge these discoveries, but attribute them to the sustainable forestry practices of the early 20th century rather than any more unusual habitation. In 1982, a survey team mapping potential sites for a natural gas pipeline reported discovering a large stump dwelling nearly 50 miles from the area documented in previous accounts. The structure, estimated to be at least 70 years old, contained several unusual artifacts, including a journal written in the same peculiar script noted in earlier discoveries and a collection of small, polished stones arranged in a pattern that matched markings found on the walls of the tunnel systems documented by Caldwell's team in 1957. The survey team's report was filed with the Department of Energy, but was subsequently classified under national security provisions. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1991 was denied, with government attorneys citing exemptions related to geological data relevant to natural resource security. Perhaps most intriguing are the accounts from longtime residents of McDowell County who claim that the Stump dwellers never truly disappeared. Jeremy Collins, whose family has lived in the region for 6 generations, told a local newspaper in 1995 that isolated sightings of men matching the description of Stump dwellers continued well into the 1970s. "My father worked for the Forest Service from 1965 to 1979, Collins stated. He would occasionally encounter men in the deepest parts of the forest who seemed to appear and vanish without warning. They wore clothing made from bark and animal hides, and their skin had a strange, rough quality to it. They never spoke but would watch from a distance before retreating into the undergrowth. The Forest Service had an unofficial policy: leave these men alone. Don't report the sightings, don't pursue them, and definitely don't try to interact with them." Collins claimed that his father had once discovered a modern version of a stump house, not built into an existing stump, but constructed to resemble one using mud, roots, and bark. Inside he found the same spiral arrangement of objects that had been documented in the original stump houses. But this was in 1973, long after the structures were supposedly abandoned. Someone was continuing the tradition for whatever reason. In 2013, a spelunking expedition in McDowell County discovered a previously unmapped cave system that appeared to connect with artificially excavated tunnels of the type described in Caldwell's 1957 survey. The team reported finding evidence of prolonged human activity within these passages before being forced to turn back due to dangerously narrow conditions. Their request for a permit to conduct a more thorough exploration was denied by the Department of Natural Resources, which cited safety concerns and the protected status of potential bat habitats in the area. What makes this discovery particularly significant is that the cave system was located more than 20 miles from the area where the original stump houses had been concentrated, suggesting that the tunnel networks extended far beyond what had previously been documented. One member of the spelunking team, who requested anonymity when interviewed by a local historian in 2014, described finding a chamber approximately 30 feet below the surface that contained several artifacts: a rusted lantern of pre-war design, tools made from modified animal bones, and most disturbingly, a collection of human teeth arranged in a pattern on a flat stone. The teeth appeared to have been deliberately extracted rather than having fallen out naturally. The team also reported unusual acoustics within certain sections of the tunnels, areas where sound seemed to propagate in impossible ways, traveling against the natural flow of air or becoming amplified beyond normal echo effects. In one passage, the team member recalled, we could clearly hear what sounded like digging or scraping from somewhere deeper in the system, though we never located the source. The Department of Natural Resources officially sealed the cave entrance following the team's report, ostensibly for safety reasons. However, local residents claim that government personnel maintained a presence in the area for several months afterward, suggesting a more extensive investigation than was publicly acknowledged. The most recent development in the Stump Houses saga occurred in 2018, when a forestry student conducting research on old-growth remnants in the Monongahela National Forest made a discovery that briefly attracted academic attention before being abruptly abandoned. The student, whose name has been withheld from public records, but whose findings were documented in a preliminary report submitted to West Virginia University's Forestry Department, discovered unusual growth patterns in trees surrounding the sites of former stump houses. According to the report, trees within a radius of approximately 50 feet from each documented stump house location exhibited accelerated growth rates, unusual morphological characteristics, and anomalous cellular structures. Core samples revealed that these trees had developed growth rings in spiral patterns, rather than the concentric circles typical of normal tree development. Most concerning was the student's observation that these unusual growth patterns had begun to appear in younger trees that had established themselves after the forest fire of 1957, suggesting that whatever had influenced the original vegetation continued to exert an effect decades later. The student's faculty advisor initially encouraged further investigation, but abruptly terminated the project following what department records describe as consultation with external agencies regarding research priorities. The student was reassigned to a different study area and advised to focus on more conventional aspects of forest ecology. Perhaps most telling is the fact that certain areas of the forest remain unofficially restricted. Local guides refuse to lead visitors to these locations, and generational knowledge keeps residents away from what one longtime hunter described as places where the trees watch you differently. A retired Forest Service employee speaking on condition of anonymity to a regional historian in 2015 claimed that certain sections of the Monongahela National Forest remain under unofficial surveillance. There are cameras hidden in trees in areas where no official monitoring stations are supposed to exist, the employee stated. When I asked about their purpose, I was told they were for wildlife observation, but they're positioned to monitor specific approaches to valleys where stump houses were once concentrated. The employee also described occasional joint operations involving Forest Service personnel and individuals who presented federal credentials, but were not affiliated with any agency the employee recognized. These operations typically occurred following reports of unusual activity in the deep forest, lights seen at night, strange sounds, or sightings of individuals who matched historical descriptions of stump dwellers. Most disturbing was the employee's claim that in 1998, a hiker reported finding a fresh excavation resembling the entrance to a tunnel system near an area locally known as Sawyer's Ridge. Within hours, the site was cordoned off by men who arrived in unmarked vehicles. The area remained restricted for nearly 2 weeks. When access was restored, the reported opening had been filled in and replanted so thoroughly that no evidence of disturbance remained. These accounts suggest that whatever drove men to hollow out massive tree stumps and dig elaborate tunnel systems beneath the Appalachian forest floor continues to exert an influence, and that official awareness and concern about this influence persists, despite public denials and administrative erasure. The stump houses of Appalachia stand as a reminder that the mountains hold secrets that defy easy explanation, that beneath the surface of recorded history lie currents of human experience that occasionally breach into documentation before being subsumed once more by silence and official denial. What transformed ordinary men into stump dwellers? What were they excavating beneath their unusual homes? Why did they vanish simultaneously, leaving behind their possessions? And perhaps most importantly, why did county, state, and federal authorities go to such lengths to erase their existence from public record? The answers may lie buried in restricted archives, lost to fire and intentional destruction, or still waiting beneath the roots of the Appalachian forests in darkness that has never known light. As you retire for the evening, perhaps in a home with solid walls and a foundation that reaches only a few feet into the earth, consider what might lie deeper. In the hollows and valleys of Appalachia, the old-growth forests were felled long ago, but their massive stumps, those too large or too remote to be removed, remain slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Some still show to the discerning eye evidence of modification, a smoothed edge here, a deliberate hollow there. And beneath them, if local accounts are to be believed, tunnels stretch through darkness toward something that calls to certain men who begin by hollowing out stumps and end by hollowing out themselves. Perhaps most unsettling is the thought that this call may not have ended with the abandonment of the original stump houses. Perhaps it continues, reaching out to those who venture too deep into certain parts of the forest or dig too far beneath the mountain soil. In the words attributed to the stump dweller identified only as marsh, the mountains keep what's put in them, but they also reveal things slowly, reluctantly, in fragments that resist coherent assembly. And sometimes, What is revealed cannot be forgotten or ignored, no matter how thoroughly official records are purged or witnesses silenced. The Stump houses may be gone, their physical evidence erased by fire and time, but their legacy persists in the boundary lines on forest maps, in the areas that local guides refuse to enter, and in the occasional reports that still emerge from the deepest parts of the Appalachian wilderness. Reports of men with bark-like skin who move through the forest with unnatural silence, appearing and vanishing like shadows among the trees. And perhaps in the sound of digging that sometimes rises from beneath the forest floor, audible only to those who place their ears against the ground and listen for what moves in the darkness below.